Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Your Podcast Girl, the show for women who are or want to be podcasters. I am your host, Kinsey Roberts, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm delighted to have you with me. If this is your first time here, if you found us through search, on Your Podcast Girl, we talk about tips, resources, information, how to start a podcast, how to grow your podcast. That's what we're all about here. I am a passionate advocate for women podcasters. So if that feels like something that resonates with you, you're definitely in the right place. I am for women starting podcasts that support their life, business, career, or passion project. That's our thing. Today, I am going over 10 types of podcasts you can start. One of the questions I often get from my students before they dive into podcasting is, what should my podcast be about? And more importantly, what kind of style should my podcast take? So stylistically, what should I be doing? What's going to serve my business? What's going to serve my career or my passion project? Whatever you're doing this podcast for, what style of podcast is going to serve that thing the best? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to give you 10 options, and then you can take that information, take what you like, leave the rest as always, take that information and decide what you think will serve you the best and what you're trying to achieve with your podcast. So let's just dive right in with number one. Number one is a solo podcast. Your Podcast Girl is a solo show. I am the main host. I don't interview people. I'm teaching you information in each of my podcast episodes. That's a solo podcast. It's one person. And I recommend this style of podcast to my students who are wanting to sell products and services. They have a business, they have a side hustle that they want to be seen as the expert on with their listeners. I recommend a solo podcast. And the reason I recommend that is because you do want your listeners to see you as the expert. You want them to come to your podcast for information about that specific topic. So for instance, if you are in the health and wellness space, let's say you are a coach who coaches women over 50 on how to lose belly fat. Well, if you have a podcast that is just you, and each week you're showing up consistently for your audience on this solo podcast to share how they can lose belly fat as a woman over 50, well, they're going to see you as the expert. They're going to see you as the person who's providing valuable content that they've used that has helped them lose their belly fat. And so when you have a product or a service to sell, well, who are they going to come buy that from? It's going to be you. Now, some of my students have said, well, if I have an interview show, then I will get more listeners because the interviewee will bring all of their audience. And that's true. But what happens with those types of shows is that your guest becomes the expert. And that's okay because there's still value in that. But you're going to want to make sure that you incorporate a healthy dose of solo episodes because we want you to be seen as the expert so that you are the one who is sharing their products and services that the audience wants to buy. They're not running around trying to find your guests. Again, it's still okay. And I'm going to get into that because that's called a hybrid show. But you want to have a healthy dose of solo podcast episodes or a completely solo podcast if you are trying to be seen as an expert in a specific industry and you have products or services that you are trying to sell. Podcast type number 2 is an interview style. So I just touched on this a little bit, and it's exactly the way it sounds. This is you interviewing another person in the specific industry or niche that your podcast is serving, and they are the star of that episode. How your interview takes shape is totally up to you. I'll give you an example. My podcast in the wedding industry is called She Creates Business, a podcast for wedding pros. That's an interview-based show. I do stick in a few solo episodes here and there, but it started as an interview show. That's the point of the podcast. I want to highlight other women's voices in the wedding industry. And so I bring on a guest expert twice a week to talk about a specific topic. So I'm not just doing what's your story based episodes. I'll bring in someone on a Tuesday to talk about Instagram and how to do video marketing on Instagram. And then on a Thursday, I'll bring in a wedding planner to talk about how to attract your ideal client if you want to do weddings that are 50 to 100K budgets. See how specific those are? That's the style of my interview show. But maybe you want to do a story-based show. Maybe that's your jam. So let's say you are in the motherhood space. Let's say you're a doula, or maybe you're a nurse, but you want to do just story-based motherhood opportunities. And so you bring on guests that they don't even have to be experts. Maybe they are just bloggers in the motherhood space, and you bring them on to share their story about being a mother. And that's a great way to do it as well, because that builds community. You're still showing up for your listeners. You're still showing up for your audience. And the interviewee in that scenario is showing up to say, hey, we're in this together. That's the message of your show. It depends stylistically when it comes to interview-based podcasts. It depends what you're trying to achieve with your specific podcast, as always, as it does with all of these types. But there's actually different kind of styles and tones that even an interview-based show in general can take. So that's an example. Number 3 is everyone's favorite, and the one we have to thank for making podcasting mainstream, of course, is a documentary style. You could also call this documentary investigative style. So, of course, the ever popular Serial podcast is a perfect example of a documentary/investigative style podcast. Cold Case is another one. All of those shows that do murder mysteries that take you through the story in a documentary style tone, you could have a show like that. Sometimes, not always, especially now that we have a lot of basically murder podcasts on air, which are awesome. People love them, right? Essentially, with Serial, you had to listen to that chronologically to understand what was going on with the story. That's really, for me, what makes it more of a documentary, because you're trying to follow it. Episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, right? You need to follow it chronologically to understand. Whereas some of these documentary style shows, they're actually just doing a documentary per episode. There is a podcast called Notorious, and that is actually a hybrid of being a documentary show and being an interview show, in my opinion, where he brings on guest experts to talk about one specific instance of, a mystery in the past. And that guest expert, number 1, he's interviewing them, but number 2, it's a documentary style because that guest expert is taking you through this, past mystery in a documentary style tone. So that's a documentary style. That's number 3. And you could certainly do that with a lot of, I know we really see that. It really lends itself well to story-driven content. That's why I think a lot of these like cold case shows, murder mystery shows, that's why they all kind of take on that tone. But I think a documentary could be used for anything. If you are I'm going to go back to kind of a motherhood example. Maybe you're in the infertility space, or maybe you're in the diabetes space, medical is kind of what I'm thinking. You could do a documentary style show if you wanted to follow one of your clients, or 1 or 3 or 5 of your clients for a whole year, and document their journey with infertility or diabetes or losing weight or something like that. You know what I mean? So that could be a documentary style show. And then I've touched on this a little bit. This would be number 4, which is a hybrid of a solo/interview show. And a lot of podcasts can take this shape. She Creates Business, my podcast, takes this shape. I mentioned that earlier. I do interviews. I also do solo episodes on that podcast. There's quite a few podcasts. Notorious, the one I just talked about, he does some episodes earlier, I think, in the show. He did some episodes by himself, but now he mostly just does interviews. But a lot of, I think, business owners, a lot of entrepreneurs do a hybrid show where they are doing solo episodes to share their experience, share their expertise, and then they're bringing on other guests to share about another niche expertise that guest has. So I see a lot of entrepreneurs doing that, and that's totally an option. This is a cool option if you have an expertise that you want to share, but you also, realize, and maybe like this is the case with entrepreneurs and business owners, they understand that they're the expert in the one thing. Maybe it's YouTube, maybe it's social media, but they really want to get someone on to talk about blogging or SEO, and that's not their wheelhouse. So they'd bring on someone else to talk about that. Number 5 is a current events podcast. One of these, I think, and these are current events. All of the news podcasts are current events shows. Katie Couric, Katie Couric from the Today Show, she used to have a podcast. As of this recording, it's no longer publishing new episodes, but it's still on iTunes if you want to find it. She would talk about current events. She had a really cool interview show, but she would combine her interviews with really relevant topics of the times, of the day. And anything following the presidency, of course. I know as I'm recording this, that's been a volatile topic, but those are all current event podcasts. And then here's one that's a little bit more lighthearted. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle got married, a bunch of podcasts popped up to cover that whole saga, and they are still in existence now, and they're just covering their marriage. That's a current events podcast. Number 6, this is a teaching podcast. Now, this can take a couple of variations. This could take a few turns. Teaching, you could start a teaching podcast that is teaching one thing. And then once you have taught a person that thing, you're done. And you just use that body of work to refer people back to. So I'm thinking this could be good for like the agricultural industry. If you wanted to do a solo episode, teaching your ag audience about one style of planting or one style of raising animals or what have you, then you could be done. You could do a podcast, however many episodes that takes you. And then if it's evergreen content, meaning it doesn't expire, meaning there's only there's only a few ways to plant stuff or to raise animals, then that could just be your body of work. You don't have to record new episodes. And that's how you refer people. Maybe you have an agricultural website. Maybe you are a teacher at a community college or something like that. This could be a cool way to share your expertise with students or with people who follow your website, but also just get your body of work out there. Number 7, you could provide a service through your podcast. I know I've seen some people who take people through yoga practice on a podcast, which I think is really interesting and a cool way to do it. And I'm subscribed to one myself. I've seen people do meditation. That's a service, and they sell things through those podcasts. They have, the particular one that I listen to that I'm subscribed to for meditation. She has a meditation app and she has a membership site for meditation, but every day, she shows up consistently to do a 10-minute meditation. And that's a service that she provides. So that's an option, is just to do a quick 10-minute, maybe it's a meditation, maybe it's a yoga, maybe it's hey, here's a quick smoothie recipe for wellness. If you are in real estate, it is, hey, do this for 10 minutes. You say, do this thing at your house if you're trying to sell it really quickly. And every day you just show up and give somebody a 10-minute tip. That's more of a service you're providing. Number 8 is a review podcast. And if you're an avid podcast junkie like I am, maybe you've come across all of the amazing book review podcasts that there are. There are a lot of those, and I love them. Keep them coming, book reviewers, because I'm into it. But that's an example. You could review books. You could review products in your space. You could review services in your space. You can bring on other people to talk about products or books or services they've tried. So that's a review podcast. Books really are the ones that come to mind that I've seen have the most success, because reading has, thank you Oprah's book club, Reese Witherspoon's book club. It's kind of seen a resurgence in popularity, even though I know many of us right now have been readers all of our lives. But that is what when I say review podcast, that's really the one thing that comes to mind. But you could take that and run with it with any topic. It doesn't have to be just books. Number 9 is an entertainment podcast. These are fun. This has been successful and a cool thing to see when podcasts that are the topic of the podcast is based on a popular TV show. So there's a Walking Dead podcast. There are some Game of Thrones podcasts. That's fun, right? Some other ones, there's celebrity entertainment podcasts. There's one specifically I'm thinking of called The Popcast. That one's really fun. Those are just two friends who love pop culture, and they discuss it on their podcast every week, and they're hysterical. So that's called the P-O-P cast. But anyway, that could be one. Entertainment. It doesn't have to all be serious, right? It doesn't have to be about business or current events or politics or anything like that. It can just be something you enjoy that brings you happiness and, brings a little bit of spunk into your life. And then finally, number 10, this one, and again, a lot of these kind of intertwine at times, right? Like this is a teaching style episode, but it's in a podcast that has more of a thematic solo podcast theme. So that's really interesting to me. None of these are not all mutually exclusive. Your podcast is going to ebb and flow, and it's up to you to decide what works best for you, and it'll be great, right? So number 10 is storytelling. And interview shows, I mentioned this earlier, interview episodes can be a lot of storytelling sometimes, but storytelling specifically for me, I'm thinking of a lot of history podcasts. Those are storytelling podcasts because they're sharing something that has already happened in the past, so they're telling you that story. So some history podcasts, of course, the big one, Stuff You Missed in History. There's one called any crime podcast, again, not even like Cold Case. Some of them are documentary style that I mentioned, but a lot of those crime podcasts, those are all story-based podcasts, and they're telling you a story, right? Like they're taking you through the journey of a specific event. That is what storytelling is. And there's another podcast. I appreciate this one because it's unlike anything that I've really seen before, and it's called Craft Lit. So I don't know a ton about the host or the person who started the podcast, but all I know is she actually brings people on to read older books like Sense and Sensibility, The Count of Monte Cristo, and books like that you can, publicly share now. And it's really cool. I mean, that's a storytelling podcast, but she's reading books that you could certainly read yourself, but it's kind of an audiobook. It's kind of an audiobook podcast, I guess, now that I'm thinking about it. And she talks about some other things on there too as well. But like I said, I don't know the host or what her story is with starting that podcast, but I know that I enjoyed when she did Sense and Sensibility, and I listened to the whole thing, and that was really fun. So cool way to start a podcast and something unexpected. It's not the traditional, kind of like this show is a traditional teaching show, or, my other show is a traditional interview show. She has a really neat niche that she's kind of carved out there. So those are the 10 those are the 10 types of podcasts that you could start. So that's kind of the style that your podcast can be. I'm just going to go over them really quickly. Once again, you probably hear my paper moving around back here, but number 1 is a solo podcast, like Your Podcast Girl, the podcast you're listening to now. Number 2 is an interview podcast. Number 3 is documentary style. That would be like Serial as an example. Number 4 is a hybrid of solo/interview shows where you do some solo episodes. You also bring on guest experts to interview. Number 5 is a current events podcast. Number 6 is a teaching podcast where you teach about one topic. Number 7 is providing a service via your podcast, like meditation, like a daily yoga practice. Number 8 is a review podcast, like book review podcast. Number 9 is an entertainment podcast. Maybe it's about TV shows. Maybe it's about celebrities. Maybe it's like the Popcast that I mentioned, where you're just talking all things popular culture. And number 10, finally, is a storytelling podcast. That's what I have for you today. I hope these give you some ideas of how you can style your podcast, even if you already have one. If you're looking to change it stylistically, if you're looking to breathe new life into it, or you haven't started your podcast yet and you've been kind of, back and forth about maybe what you should do for it and what would be cool and what would really serve your listeners. I hope these 10 styles will give you some thoughts to share, or give you some thoughts and help you move forward with styling your own show and launching it, or maybe relaunching it to a new audience. Hope you guys are having a great day. I will see you on the next episode.